Crow, directed by Rupert Sanders, stars Bill Skarsgård, FKA Twigs, and Danny Huston. Soulmates Eric and Shelley are brutally murdered when the demons of her past catch up with them. Given the chance to save his true love by sacrificing himself, Eric sets out to seek merciless revenge on their killers, traversing the worlds of the living and the dead to put the wrong things right. Before going into this movie, skeptical doesn't begin to explain the words on how I felt about it, as the original The Crow movie is such an important film that's very near and dear to my heart. While it may be a product of its time, it's still flawless, and despite it might flaw to other people, I'd consider it a masterpiece. So naturally, with the slew of modern Hollywood remakes, it had a lot to live up to, and the advertisements really didn't help this case, but I do my best not to judge a movie on its trailer alone, as I think it's best to judge a film after properly seeing it for yourself all the way through. With all that being said, how exactly did this version of The Crow live up to both the original film and as an adaptation of the graphic novel itself? First, I'll start with the performances, starting with Bill Skarsgård's. I've liked this guy in a few films I've seen him in. I thought he was especially great in Barbarian, and in terms of the casting itself, I don't think having him as Eric Draven is a completely terrible idea. What threw me through a loop was when a lot of images started coming out which showcased his design, which was shown off more in the actual movie. Before I get into the performance itself, I will say I think his overall design in this movie is terrible. The hairstyle doesn't work and doesn't look anywhere near as cool as the original, and I think the biggest offender his design has is the amount of really poorly done, overly edgy design tattoos, which were genuinely sickening to look at. He has multiple face tattoos, which not only made him look like some meth-addicted SoundCloud rapper, but it did give me vibes of Jared Leto's Joker. Now on to his actual performance. It's hard to talk about, as I don't fully blame Bill for the way he acts in this. I know he can pull off a good performance, so I think this is mainly down to really poor material he's given to work with, and obviously under pretty bad direction. Most of the time, he delivers really cringy lines of dialogue, especially in times of the romance scenes. I thought there were some moments which were mostly embarrassing for the actual character of the Crow itself. When we see Eric get put into danger during the first and second acts of the movie, he spends these moments screaming like a little bitch, which felt so wrong for this type of character. The way he carries himself throughout the runtime, he perceives himself to emulate your local weird kid, who will eat this movie up, by the way. When he's tasked with doing the action scenes, when it's clear it's not a body double, he seems to have the believability to pull all these types of scenes off well. A weird addition this movie has, it felt like part of Skarsgård's contract being in this was that for about 80% of the movie, he had to just take his shirt off. There is literally a fight scene where he's fighting a guy, and the guy he's fighting just out of nowhere rips his shirt off as they're fighting, and it was laughable how obvious it was, but at the same time, I suppose it's refreshing to see an actor under the female gaze rather than the other way around. It's definitely one of the weakest performances from him in a while, and I think he himself knew it wasn't worth putting a lot of effort into. FKA Twigs plays Eric's other half, his partner Shelley, and she is just really terrible here. I think this is the woman's debut acting role as far as I'm aware, and while this may come off as very blunt, I think her talents are definitely more suited in the music industry, and she should just stick to singing and performing music. She delivers every line as if it's his first take every single time. She was unable to convey pretty much any emotions throughout the entire runtime, and any attempt to do so always felt flat. When I'm talking about the relationship between the two leads, this is the fault of a combination of both Skarsgård and Twigs together, but of course more so down to the director. It didn't feel believable at all, and they just held absolutely no chemistry between each other, which became really disappointed to deal with very fast, as this is what takes up the majority of the runtime, but I'll get more into that later. Danny Huston displays another pretty embarrassing performance here, and is pretty bad too, playing an extremely generic, uninteresting, and most importantly, non-threatening villain here. He holds no weight in the overall story and displays a limited amount of actually trying to bring in something worthwhile in this department. Anytime he was on screen, he failed to make a convincing argument for why anything he's doing is interesting, which made it pretty much impossible to feel engaged or even scared by his performance. I'm struggling to see where else I can take this review, since this is such a mess of a movie. I guess I'll start with talking about the direction it takes its story in, while doing my best not to compare it to the original '94 film, as this movie is just another adaptation of the original graphic novel, rather than just being a straight up remake of that original movie. This movie spends a good chunk of its first act developing the romance between Eric and Shelley. This takes up about 40 minutes of the runtime, which obviously so quickly causes a massive problem with this version, and it doesn't help with how they decide to develop the romance itself. There isn't a sense of time in this portion of the movie, or even the whole runtime as a whole, and so we see this romance in the movie, the way the two characters become so infatuated with each other, it just doesn't seem believable. To explain, I'll give very light spoilers, but the two of them meet in a rehab center. Shelley decides to break out, and Eric follows, but we are only really led to believe he leaves with her because he wants to get out too, and not because he cares about her as a person. The brief glimpses into the relationship that we see are basically crammed into a montage full of the two of them constantly using drugs and having sex, and maybe on the odd occasion actually spending time together and looking like they have fun, but this is only really shown about once until they are inevitably killed off. Along with this, their vomit-inducing romance is loading with really cringe-inducing monologues between each other that would have done numbers on Tumblr and MySpace years ago. The villains in this movie, with their inclusion alone, is not only handled so poorly, but is just moronic and shows the filmmaker's lack of knowledge into the original source material. To summarize, the Crow graphic novel was made in the author's grief after his girlfriend was killed in a car accident, and after this incident, he had blamed himself. The point of the villains in the comic and the original movie are meant to be random as a sort of manifestation of this occurrence, and the fact that this movie has the villains in this big bad sort of syndicate is really just laughable, which of course leads to it being really bland and generic, which is something the original movie never had a problem with. When Eric faced off against these multiple goons, they all had their own thing going on, making them unique from each other. Here the goons are nothing more than faceless men to be axed off with ease by Eric in really bloody and gruesome ways, which I will admit was a little refreshing to see. While not all the gore effects looked good and has an over-reliance on CGI blood, all of the kills themselves are actually fun to watch, especially a sequence of Eric killing a bunch of people in the opera house. This action sequence is certainly one of the highlights of the movie. The way this movie handles the character of the Crow itself is really insulting to see too, especially if you're a fan of the IP. For most of the movie, Eric is more of this zombie-like figure until the last 30 minutes of the movie, before finally becoming the actual Crow figure. Before this is mainly where we see Skarsgård's performance rely on him screaming and acting all flustered. What always worked about the Crow for me is how quickly Eric accepts his fate. He accepts that he's died and is resurrected and takes up the mantle with ease, but in this version we're subjected to really annoying moments of Eric looking at himself, wondering why these things are happening to him, which we've seen done to death in so many superhero origin stories. This movie opts out of the campy elements and goes for a more dark and gritty take on the tale, which makes it so much less fun to watch, and somehow, of all things, makes most of this movie really boring to watch. Any interesting characters and dynamics Eric would share with, say, the cop and the girl in that first movie are completely gone here, and decide to solely hole in on Eric and Shelley as the main crutch of the whole thing, mainly more to his partner, as there are times where I felt like the writers had such a hard-on for FKA Twigs, as it puts her character in an extremely high pedestal. Color palette of this is very bland and holds really no creativity in the overall look of the whole thing. Cinematography holds a lot to be desired, and it's mainly bland to look at with little to no interesting shots that stood out during the entire movie. I can't think of a single memorable looking shot in this whole thing, which shouldn't be something one is able to do when making an adaptation of this. Overall, this is a complete embarrassment of an adaptation, and luckily won't be remembered long enough to completely ruin the reputation of the original movie has gathered for itself, as that movie is still there and is still available for people to watch. Hell, I got my own version of the movie on DVD. It was everything I knew it was going to be going into it. Just another horrible example of the Hollywood reboot, sequel and remake and so on train that it's just never going to stop. Apart from maybe one or two good scenes and a mix of some pretty enjoyable songs thrown into the soundtrack, so many aspects of this fails. It takes forever for it to properly get going, as it holds a complete over-reliance on backstory, which is just unneeded and slows the movie down so much, making the majority of the runtime uninteresting and boring. Boring should never have to be a word someone should use to describe The Crow, but the 2024 version of it unfortunately has made that the case. I'm giving The Crow 2 stars. This is a poorly directed, terribly written, generic, mind-numbing, and just a borderline frustrating adaptation that displays no effort to bring anything unique to new audiences. It completely misses the point and meaning of the graphic novel this movie is based on, and is just such an embarrassment to watch from start to finish. There are fragments of cool things, like a pretty entertaining fight scene. My only hope is that this version encourages people to seek out the original movie, as this is one that should definitely be skipped. No one should be made to see this, and it certainly isn't worth your money to be seen on the big screen.